Today I'll be speaking a little bit about federal programs, how we've adapted in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy, how we approach and manage process when it comes to implementing new procedures related to rebuilding. I served as the Hurricane Sandy Task Force Liaison. This was a group that was assembled by the president to manage the rebuilding and response in the wake of the hurricane. DOT's response in the immediate aftermath of the storm, DOT deployed staff to the region, both at FEMA's coordination centers and the JFOs, the Joint Field Offices in New York and New Jersey. Altogether, 58 staff. They literally put down their day jobs to go live out of suitcases and backpacks for as much as a month. Federal motor carriers, Federal Rail Administration, they lifted hours of service regulations so that we could get trucks in place even ahead of the storm. Federal Aviation restored the air navigation system. Our Maritime Administration dispatched 2 ships from our Ready Reserve fleet. They essentially served as floating dormitories to almost 1,000 federal emergency response workers. The Pipelines Administration repairing gas distribution lines, and Federal Transit, which again was the most impacted, but in the immediate aftermath of the storm, working with FEMA and GSA to procure 250 buses. The New York State 2100 report is a theme here, is the last one, creating new incentive programs to encourage resilient behaviors and reduce vulnerabilities. The Hurricane Sandy Rebuilding Task Force was assembled. It was formalized through an executive order by President Obama in December of 2012, comprised of 14 agencies, 9 White House offices, and it was led by Housing and Urban Development Secretary Sean Donovan. This group functioned within what's called the Natural Disaster Recovery Framework, the NDRF. The NDRF, some may know, was born out of Hurricane Katrina, and it assembles best practices, process, protocol, procedures, but it's a living framework. Once the storm hit, you'll probably remember politicians were having a very long discussion about how and in what way recovery in the Sandy context should be funded. And to give a little bit of perspective, in Katrina, billions went out within 2 weeks or so of the storm's impact. Your Public Law 113-2 is work with these partners to provide recommendations for reducing vulnerabilities to future disasters and reduce costs and impacts stemming from these disasters. A presidential executive order, there's consensus at the state level and now at the congressional level. DOT shall integrate consideration of climate change impacts and adaptation into planning, operations, policies, programs. These are the principles that guide us, adopting integrated approaches, which I think you've actually seen done well in the Sandy context, prioritizing the most vulnerable of infrastructure. And then this third one here is probably the most referred to in the Sandy context, is the use of best available science or data, using not just appropriate but accurate data to incorporate into how we rebuild. In this instance, in the Northeast, using advisory-based floodplain maps. Ordinarily, floodplain elevation maps by FEMA are formalized through a process, and as you can imagine, it can be a fairly political process. We used the advisory-based floodplain elevation plus 1 foot to protect from future sea level rise. And again, this applies this standard to all the federally funded Sandy recovery projects. Within the Office of the Secretary, we are, as appropriate, embedding this into our programs such as Tiger, where in a state of good repair, improving conditions, existing transportation facilities and systems. As you can illustrate that to us through the Tiger application process, that's something that we will weigh and consider as we're evaluating these applications. Environmental sustainability as well, improving resilience of transportation assets. So FAA is already incorporating these elevated provisions into their rebuilding efforts. Federal Highways is incorporating or integrating climate resilience considerations into their programs and guidance and their policies. They've issued a memo that directs including some of this into vulnerability assessments and how they design for construction projects. They've also revised their emergency relief manual, which is now modernized to incorporate resilient approaches. The FTA, on their own discretionary side here, is incorporating resilient rebuilding into their notices for funding. They've actually put $3 billion out for funding on a competitive basis to rebuild some of these really massive projects in the region. But they too are also embedding resiliency into their programs. Ultimately, the government wants to be good stewards of taxpayer dollars. So where able and appropriate, conducting a cost-benefit analysis is highly emphasized in how we put out our guidance now. FTA is evaluating quantitative measures, qualitative information related to system performance when it comes to resiliency. We're just going to be putting money, throwing good money after bad if we continue to build these things the same way.